If you guys have been following along in this series in Mark, I hope you guys are getting excited. And, as this section starts off, it says, "And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat." If you guys remember, last week we talked about how they had just gone through the storm, and the disciples and Jesus, they got in a boat. This was their mode of transportation to get across the sea. And they were in for a ride of their lives. It was a traumatic experience. It was basically a demon-possessed storm that was wrecking their boat, and they all thought they were going to die. And, they were like desperate, and they said, "Jesus, do you not care that we're going to, sink?" And, Jesus stood up and told the winds and the waves to be still. And they're like, "Oh, man, if we get in a boat with Jesus, what's going to happen next?" I'm sure they're wondering. Maybe they heard stories. Maybe they're thinking something like Jonah will happen, where maybe they'll get swallowed up by a fish. So I'm wondering if some of them were feeling a little bit anxious getting in a boat with Jesus. And then, when they crossed, getting to the other side, wondering, just previously, they were encountered by a demon-possessed man, And now they're like, what kind of people are we going to meet here on this side of the land? But they were more receptive. These people welcomed them, and they were eager, and they were excited to see what Jesus was going to do. And that brings us to our story about a woman and the daughter of Jairus. The first thing that we're going to note here and see in this passage is a painful situation. A painful situation. And in this story that we see here, Mark sandwiches these two people, the most unlikely people on different spectrums of life. Kind of like we talked about unique food combinations. These are two unique people that somehow God brought together. Jesus is bringing together. And we see how they'll be connected in this story. The first person that we're introduced to is a man named Jairus. And we're told that he was one of the rulers of the synagogue. Now, the fact that you know his name, the fact that his name appears, shows that he had power, he had prominence. Kind of like like who the mayor of California is. That was the type of person, the level of respect that he had amongst the Jews. But on the other side, it was also a problem, because you guys all know that the Pharisees, the religious leaders, they were against Jesus. They thought that he was a lunatic, a fanatic, a heretic. Everything they were throwing the book saying, this Jesus is causing us problems, and he is not going according to the law, according to what we are studying in the Torah. But Jairus was in a desperate situation, and so he considers approaching Jesus, especially in public, in front of a crowd like this, meant that he had to swallow his pride and go up to Jesus asking desperately for his help. His daughter was sick, and I'm sure he tried everything. He took him to different doctors. They probably tried different techniques, different things, hoping that she would get through this. But she kept getting worse, and she was knocking on death's door. And if you notice the way that Jairus describes her, he says, "My little daughter." At the age of 12, I don't know if she's that little anymore. My second daughter, she's actually 12 years old, and so I thought a lot about her. And I think about, if I were to introduce my daughter to people and say, "Hey, this is my little daughter," I can already picture her like rolling her eyes. I can sense her hearing her say the word "Dad." I'm not that little anymore. In their culture, at this age, they were getting ready to be married. They're 1 year away from entering into teenagehood. But in the Gospel of Luke, we are told that this was his only daughter. And if you can imagine, his whole world was there. It was her. She was the apple of his eye. She loved her to death. He would do anything for her. She meant the world to him. And so if you're a parent, or even if you're not, this scene is heartbreaking. And he felt Jesus was the only solution to this situation. That if only Jesus would touch her, she would be well. So Jesus agrees. He's like, okay, follow me. And I'm sure he's in a rush. He's walking quickly to get to his home. But there's a great crowd of people just surrounding him. And this is where we meet the second person important to this story. We meet a woman who has this hemorrhaging problem where she's been bleeding for 12 long years. Now, I know, ladies, when you go through that cycle, it gets painful. Now that I have two girls, and my wife, I know that they have problems. Like it's not easy when you have this situation. She's been going through this for 12 years. And what's ironic is that the 12 years of her problem, it all started at the same time, the birth of the daughter of Jairus. It's interesting. That's how the connection is being made. The 12 years of age of this girl is the same amount of time that she's been suffering of this bleeding problem. And so this is probably why Mark is connecting the two of them. But we don't know her name. She remains anonymous. And because of her condition, she wasn't allowed to worship. It's not like today where you can, watch through the internet, be connected and worship with your people away from home. They didn't have that technology. And she wasn't even able to socialize on a normal basis. She's been to every doctor, and they haven't found a cure. In fact, they say that she got worse, and she spent all her money looking for a cure. So just like Jairus, she's run out of options, and she decides to turn to who? To Jesus. Because she's desperate, and she's thinking to herself, if I only touch him just a little bit, I know he can make me well. So when you look at both situations here, the bleeding woman and the daughter of Jairus, we see that they're desperate, and they look to Jesus as the only hope for change. We can either approach our God with boldness, like Jairus did with his request before Jesus, or we can come humbly from the back, just like this woman, asking for a touch, wanting to encounter Jesus. And we see that both of them do. They meet with God in a powerful way. And we see the power of Jesus and the gospel impacting their lives. But the second thing that we see in this story as we follow along is we see a painful delay. Now, you have to remember, the main focus of the story was supposed to be on Jairus and the healing of his daughter. His request was granted. He's excited. He has a glimmer of hope. He's like, yes, this man can come and save my daughter. But along the way, there's an interruption. There's a delay in the story. And the attention of Jesus is no longer on Jairus, but now it's directed towards this bleeding woman. Now let's look at the faith of this bleeding woman. And what I love about her is the courage that she displays in her action. She had to overcome hurdles and obstacles just to reach Jesus. She wasn't allowed to be around people. She wasn't allowed to touch people, but she sacrificed that just to get near to Jesus. So you can't help but admire her courage, her action, her determination, and her faith. She recognizes there's absolutely nothing that she can do to save herself. She's tried everything, and it's led to a dead end. And she's like, this is my last hope. This is the only thing I can do. And she believed in her heart. She truly did that, Jesus, you can change me. And he does. Jesus changes everything. Maybe some of you feel like this bleeding woman. You're tired of trying to do things on your own. And you've given up because you don't know where else to turn to. Maybe it's time for you to turn to Jesus, to be your only hope. And then Jesus acknowledges, he knows that a miracle is taking place. What's interesting is that he doesn't initiate this, right? This is where God the Father allows for this woman to get healed. God intervenes on his behalf. And this woman steps forward and confesses, it was me. And what's interesting in how Jesus addresses her, he says, daughter. And nowhere else in all the Gospels has any woman been addressed as daughter. This is the only woman that Jesus says, daughter, your faith has made you well. I believe he addressed her as daughter so that she will no longer feel alienated from society, but also that she will no longer be alienated from God the Father. You can now enjoy a relationship with God. So while Jesus is interacting with this woman, Jairus receives the painful news that your daughter has just passed away. Imagine the death. Imagine like the air being sucked out of your lungs. You know, how heartbreaking must have been for him to hear those words, to hear that news. Can you imagine how impatient he must have felt? He must have been in such a hurry. He's like, Jesus, we don't have time. We got to hurry up. I don't know how much longer she has left. What are you doing? You know, I'm sure he wanted to tug. I'm sure he wanted to carry him on his back and say, let's go. Why is this woman getting in the way of what's more important, my daughter? You know, we don't read about his reaction, but I can tell, as a dad, you get nervous. As a dad, you get desperate. You would do anything for your child. The question for us today is, how do we handle delays? I imagine a lot of us, we get anxious. Maybe some of us, we get angry with God. Some of us, we run away when we don't get the answers right away. God, I want to know this. I want to know, when will I get over my sickness? God, I want to know when I'll find the right job. God, I want to know when I'll find the right place to live. All these questions, all of these delays. But look at how Jesus responds to Jairus in verse 36. He says, do not fear, only believe. Do not fear, only believe. And in the Greek, this would be translated as keep believing. Don't stop, keep believing. Jesus is saying, hold on to faith and don't give in to despair, but keep believing, keep trusting in me. Do not fear. Perhaps some of us need to hear those words as well. Do not fear, only believe. You know, many would view this bleeding woman as an interruption or a delay. But I believe Jesus was using this woman as a model of faith to Jairus. He's showing him, look, I have power to heal disease. Now I'm going to show you power that can heal, that can bring the dead to life. Well, we see that it almost feels like his power is getting bigger and stronger. His power over the storm, his power over the spiritual realm, over the demon-possessed man, and now it's over disease, and now it's going to culminate in the power over death. Which leads us to our last point, a powerful deliverance. You know, at the moment when Jairus heard that his daughter was dead, he had a choice. He could have just easily said, "It's over. Jesus, all this was for nothing. Go back. Go your way. I'm sorry to bother you. This was not meant to be." It's too late. There's nothing else you can do. Or the second option was keep believing. Hold on to it. Believe what Jesus is saying, that something will happen. Now comes the moment of truth. It's one thing to hear the news, but it's also another thing to see exactly what has happened. And I'm sure that when Jairus arrived at the scene, at his home, when he saw his daughter lifeless, I'm sure his world must have fallen apart. I'm sure that he just fell on his knees crying for his daughter. But the only thing holding him together, I'm sure, was the words of Jesus, "Do not fear, only believe." Maybe that was on repeat in the back of his mind, constantly reminding himself that the man, the Savior that he's seen do a miracle just moments before, he will do it again on a greater scale, on a taller level. He's being reminded, do not fear, only believe. At this point, Jesus separates the crowd and brings only his inner circle, Peter, James, John, and the parents, into the room where this girl was. If you can imagine, there's an emotional state that's going on around. Everyone's weeping, everyone's crying. No parent should ever witness the death of their own child. And this was devastating. Everyone was wailing, everyone was crying. I'm sure the mother was in turmoil, not knowing what to do. And then Jesus addresses the crowd by making a statement that seems insane when he says in verse 39, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." Now the crowd thinks he's crazy. Like, are you serious? Do you not see? You can't do CPR. You can't bring this girl to life. She's not sleeping. She is gone. But Jesus used the word sleep in a way of saying that death is not permanent, that he would raise this girl from the dead as if waking someone from their sleep. And then as he approaches the girl, he does two things. First of all, he touches her, and then secondly, he says the two words, Talitha Kumi, which in an instant, the girl comes to life. Now, what's interesting in that interaction with this girl is that he did not have to touch her. In fact, according to the law, he was not supposed to, because they were not allowed to touch dead corpses. So for Jesus to do something like this, I'm sure the inner circle, Peter, James, and John, were looking at him like, "What are you doing? Don't you see she's dead?" He was potentially making himself defiled by touching a dead person. But this is how he is connected to this woman. Because in the same way, when the woman touched him, it defiled him, technically according to the law. The same way, when he touched this dead girl, he should have been defiled. But what he's showing here is that he is the fulfillment of the law. He's showing that there is a great exchange taking place here. He's taking their disease, he's taking death and exchanging it with life, with righteousness, holiness is what he's giving to these people. And that is what Jesus does for us today. He takes our sins. He takes the things that we cannot solve, and he exchanges it with his holiness and clothes us with his righteousness. Let's close in prayer. These two people fall at the feet of Jesus, the bleeding woman and a desperate father, and they both find exactly what they're looking for in Jesus alone. Jairus learned that God's timing purpose are not like ours. Sometimes he requires patience from us. Sometimes he waits longer than we think is rational. And sometimes he allows temporary loss in order to show us the eternal abundance of his blessing. It didn't matter if it was a prominent person or a nameless person. Jesus graciously met their needs and responded to their faith. God allows you to come to the point where you realize that you have the inability to do anything or have control over your situation. We have to look to Jesus. Because only he can provide what we cannot do. So as we take time to pray, if we can also prepare for our communion, well, can we also pray that, Lord, whatever lessons that he wants to teach us through the delays, through the painful season that we may be in. Maybe some of you are sick, or maybe some of you are waiting for something to happen. Make sure you wait. Make sure you hear the words of Jesus. Do not fear, only believe.